So, why do poor countries in general have lower rates of taxation than higher income countries? Specifically, I'm talking about the top rate of income taxation. There are two phenomenons causing this, but the one I want to talk about first is that the rich in most low-income countries are still rich enough that they can essentially have a much easier time migrating to any country they want. So most rich countries have programs where if you pay certain amounts of money, then you could obtain permanent residence. In the United States, it's about $500,000. In Germany, it says here it's about 360,000 euros. The same in Portugal, roughly. And in Turkey, which is the high-income country, it's 250,000 euros. So, people in the top 1% of India earn, at a minimum, 77,000 a year. So, people who earn 77,000 a year can probably come up with $250,000 it takes to immigrate to a lot of these countries I talked about. I mean, they might have a slightly difficult time coming up with the 500,000 it takes to immigrate to a lot of other developed countries, but a person at the 0.5% percentile, the top 0.5 percentile in India, probably could afford to immigrate to any developed country they wanted to, if they wanted. So according to this, you only need about 40,000 euros per adult to immigrate to Austria. And it only takes $70,000 to migrate to Malaysia. So again, most Indians in the top 1% could probably afford to migrate to maybe a quarter or a third of developed countries, and probably all Indians in the top 0.5% could migrate to any developed country they wanted to. And that's just India, a lower income country. In middle income countries like China, Brazil, and South Africa, the top 1% earn a lot more, so they probably all could afford to migrate to any developed country they wanted. So as I was saying, it wouldn't be too hard for someone earning $77,000 a year to come up with the $200,000 it takes to migrate to a lot of developed countries, and they could very easily come up with the $70,000 it takes to migrate to Malaysia. And Malaysia is probably a very good choice for an Indian migrating because it's relatively geographically close, and there's already a large Indian community in Malaysia. Plus, a lot of individuals in the top 1% of countries possess certain high-demand skills. Okay, a lot of high-income earners in the top 1% of developing countries possess very highly in-demand skills that are strongly desired in developed countries, and so that makes them qualified for occupational visas that essentially put them in the front of the line and are a lot easier to obtain for people with qualifications than just a general visas. So probably a large portion, if not a majority, could immigrate that way using high-skilled visas for occupations, too. So essentially what this amounts to is that most of the top 1% in all but the very poorest developing countries can essentially migrate to any higher income country they want to. So if you could migrate to any higher income country, why wouldn't you? There are strong, compelling reasons to do so. For one thing, the countries just have a better quality of life and just better infrastructure and services. In addition, because incomes are a lot higher in developed countries, probably 25% of jobs in a high-income country would pay more than the top 1%, what the top 1% of people earn in India. So, if there are 25 times more jobs that pay that highly in a developed country compared to your home country, then you're essentially guaranteed to find a position that pays at least as well as your old position, if not more. And if you're getting paid a position that pays the same amount, then because that position is much lower on the income percentile distribution, it's going to be taxed at a much lower rate. Conversely, even if you pay the same high rate of taxation as you did in your home country, because incomes are generally a lot higher, you're still going to be earning a lot more money, so you're taxed the same rate, but it's on a much higher income because the top 1% of earners in high-income countries earn a lot more than the top 1% of income earners do in low-income countries. So, for example, in the UK, you'd earn almost 4 times as much, and in Germany, it would be 4 times as much too. While in the US, it would be like 6 times as much, or 5 times as much. Because you'd have to be earning in the top 1% in the new developed country you're living in to qualify for the same top rates of taxation that you were paying in your old country. So because the proportion of jobs that are paying at least as much as the top 1% of income earners earn is 25%, so there are like 25% times more jobs that pay at least as much, you're guaranteed a job that pays at least as much as you were earning, if not more. And either you pay the same higher rates of taxation, but you're earning a lot more in income, or you're earning the same income, but you're paying much lower rates of taxes. So the incentive to migrate to higher income developed countries, if you're in the top 1% of lower income country, is huge. Because there are huge tax advantages, and there's a higher quality of life, and there's a huge potential to earn an outright higher amount of income. Because of this huge potential of high-income earners to simply leave, and a huge loss of tax revenue, governments of developing countries in general simply can't impose as high of taxes as in the richest countries, because then the highest income earners of these countries will simply have no reason not to leave. So with lower rates of taxation, you would be earning a lower amount of income, but you'd be getting taxed on it less. Or you'd be earning the same amount of income as a higher income country, but at least you're getting taxed only the same amount, proportionally as you would in the higher income country. And that is a major reason why taxes in developed countries are simply unable to be as high as the rates of taxation in developed countries. Of course, the other reason that rates of taxation are lower is just simply the higher levels of corruption in those countries and the lower amount of resources going to the tax system and just a general lower amount of administrative functioning in general. So just because of a higher amount of corruption and dysfunction, tax evasion is a lot more prevalent and easier to get away with. And because governments simply have to deal with the reality that higher amounts of tax evasion are just a fact, then lower rates of taxation to simply deal with the reality that it's just harder to raise tax revenue is also a result of this. So that's the other reason why rates of taxation are generally lower. Because of higher levels of corruption and just the reality that tax evasion is more prevalent, and you just have to deal with that reality because it simply exists. Okay, so now that I've explained that, I want to look at this map again. So there are some interesting dynamics. Malaysia's a high-income economy now, but because it's right next to Singapore, which has even higher income and has very low rates of taxation, people in Malaysia have the potential to move to Singapore, so they have to keep their tax rates fairly low, and that makes Malaysia an extremely good destination for people from India to migrate. And because of this, India also is compelled to not have taxes that are too high. Most of the Gulf countries have very high levels of income and no income tax because they get all the revenue from oil, so they don't need an income tax. What this means is that since Egypt is right next to those countries and has a similar language and a culture that makes Egyptians used to living under the similar cultural conditions of the Arabian Peninsula, there is a very high propensity of Egyptians to move there. So Egypt also has to have quite low levels of taxation. Not now, but recently, like 10 years ago, a lot of Eastern European economies had much lower levels of income, but were still part of the European Union, meaning that their citizens could migrate to the higher income Western European countries automatically with no strings attached. So because of the ease of migration, these countries had to and ended up enacting very low rates of taxation so as to disincentivize migration to Western European countries where there were either much higher levels of income or the people there might be taxed at lower rates because their levels of income would be at a lower percentile and so at a lower tax rate. Not to mention they could still migrate to Switzerland, which just has outright low rates of taxation in general. So the middle income Eastern European countries ended up having to enact fairly low rates of taxation too. Russia has low rates of taxation more because of the sheer corruption of the country and the ineffectiveness of the tax administration than directly because of migration, though that did happen too. So these tax dynamics that I've explained on this map are very interesting. So, a lot of Eastern European countries ended up enacting very low levels of taxation because they had to counteract brain drain to Western Europe. But with the rise of remote work, a lot of high-income Germans, Austrians, and Swedes are probably going to start migrating to these Eastern European countries for tax reasons. So Swedes would move to the Baltics, Germans would move to the Czech Republic, Austrians would move to the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. And because those countries are so close to each other, or even directly bordering each other, it's going to happen on an extremely large scale. So that's ironic and going to be interesting to see. Ireland, on paper, seems to have high income taxes, but because it's Ireland, I'm willing to bet they'd let a lot of people incorporate very easily with a wink and a nod, and so their income would be taxed at the corporate tax rate rather than the nominal personal income tax rate. So it's interesting how many countries with high levels of taxation immediately border countries with much lower levels. So Germany and France border Switzerland and Luxembourg. The UK borders Ireland. Germany and Austria border the Czech Republic and Hungary. Well, that seems to be the case in Europe.